The Nova Scotia Progressive Conservatives have won a majority government in the provincial election. With all but 2 of 55 ridings called Tuesday night, the Tories were elected in 31 districts. Tory leader Tim Houston said the public responded to the solutions he put forward and decided against simply rewarding the Liberals for proficiently handling the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite the defeat, Liberal leader Ian Rankin says he has no plans to step down. Joining us today to discuss the election results is Dr. Laurie Turnbull, the director of the School of Public Administration and an associate professor of political science at Dalhousie University. Doctor, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So let's start with a quick overview of the Nova Scotia campaign and the results today.
Sure. So the campaign was almost necessary as compared to the federal one. The federal campaign being called, not even 2 years into the mandate. The Liberal government was actually in the 5th year of their mandate. We don't have fixed election dates in Nova Scotia, so it was sort of time to get on with it in a way. The parties aren't hugely different ideologically, like they have some things that set them apart, but for the most part, they all are focused on things like healthcare, affordable housing, mental health services, environment, things like that. And so there was a bit of a sense that voters might move around because all of the parties were offering sort of similar kinds of platforms. Again, some differences kind of keeping them apart, but there's not a huge space between the parties.
So what would you say has been the biggest takeaway for you after watching this election?
Well, at the beginning, it really looked like Premier Rankin and the Liberals were going to win it. And he was hugely ahead in the polls. I mean, we knew that lead would soften a bit once the campaign started because during COVID, we didn't have really any meetings of the legislature here. And so normal politics was done and the focus was really on the government. It looked like the Liberals were going to take it all, but then campaigns matter. As we went through, more people shifted their vote. The other parties, the other leaders had more of an impact on the conversation and they resonated more. And now instead of what people thought was probably going to be a majority Liberal government, we have majority PC.
And considering that this provincial election was held during the pandemic, how did the provincial parties adapt their campaigns to the situation with COVID-19?
So we don't have a lot of COVID in Nova Scotia. I think we have fewer than 10 cases now. And throughout the campaign, there was not any sort of growth in cases. We have a high vaccination rate here. So they have to still do, kind of what is expected in terms of masking and things like that. The leaders roundtable was virtual rather than in person. But for the most part, I don't think it affected things a huge amount. Like they were still able to go out and door knock and meet with people and things like that.
Now, turning to the current federal election, could you talk about some of the impacts that the pandemic may have on this particular election?
I think it's more complicated from the federal perspective because just of the size of the country, what's happening in Nova Scotia in the sense that there's not an acute sense of a public health crisis here. That's not necessarily going to be the case for all of the provinces for the entire election. Like we can see cases rising in Ontario and Alberta. And so the sense of safety we have here in Nova Scotia might not endure the entire campaign in every jurisdiction. So I think it's challenging from that perspective. It's also challenging in the sense that there are a number of people who really don't feel that this is the right time to have an election. They may choose not to engage at all. If the politicians may find it harder to haul their usual vote if people decide they're not going to switch on for this.
All right, Dr. Turnbull, just about a minute left, but I want to go back to an article in The Star that you were quoted in. You were discussing what we might expect from each of the front runners in this federal election. So could you share with us what challenges each party leader will face throughout this campaign?
Sure. I mean, starting with Trudeau, I think he's got a sense of momentum behind him. He called this election, I think, largely for strategic reasons. He wants his majority. And I think it's hard for him to argue against that. He's made some points around the election being a time for people to weigh in because we haven't had a chance to do that since COVID started. That's fine. But I think he still has to explain a bit, why we're out here. Now, that said, I don't think voters will punish him for it unless the situation with COVID gets worse and it starts to look like a safety concern. Aaron O'Toole and Jagmeet Singh are under a lot of pressure, I think, to prove themselves in this election. Singh didn't have as good a campaign the last time as he wanted, so he didn't have as good of results as he wanted. This time, I think there's a lot of pressure on him to show, despite the fact that the Liberals are really leaning left, he still has something to give to voters. Vote NDP, even though the Liberals want to give you a huge social safety net. For Aaron O'Toole, this is a make or break moment for him. He has released a Conservative campaign, which gives a lot of detail about what he wants to do and how he wants to rebuild after COVID, which is not about huge government programs. It's about governments giving money to businesses, individuals, and saying, invest this yourself, figure out how, you know best, you do your thing, and we'll help you do it, which is a very different approach than the Liberal one. enemy Paul is in a situation where the party is in civil war. I don't really know how the Greens are going to emerge from this, to be honest. Yves Blanchette is going to probably have a more tricky fight on his hands in Quebec this time than he did last time. The Liberals are very hungry for those seats in order to get the majority.